The scream ended the way a candle did when a wet thumb pinched it. Not with a flourish, with a sudden ugly absence. Corvin's hand had already gone to his pistol. He did not look startled. He looked corrected, like the ship had spoken in a language he trusted. Adrian's eyes sharpened, the humor from moments ago draining clean away. The quartermaster stood in the doorway, pale as tallow, the words catching on his throat. "Captain." Corvin's voice went low. "Show me." He took one step, then stopped. His gaze flicked to Adrian as if Adrian was a piece that had shifted on the board. "You," Corvin said, "not unkind, not negotiable. You stay with me. You don't leave my sight." Adrian's mouth opened, ready with something elegant and poisonous. Corvin's eyes cut it off before it was born. "That's not a request. You're under my protection. You're close to me at all times." Protection on Corvin's tongue did not sound like kindness. It sounded like ownership sharpened into duty. Adrian studied him for a half-beat, then gave a small, courtly incline of his head. "As you command," Adrian said, just insolent enough to remind everyone in the room that obedience could still be a performance. Corvin holstered the pistol and moved. The quartermaster led them down the narrow passage, lantern jittering in his grip. The ship's belly smelled of gunpowder, old smoke and iron. Men pressed themselves to the walls to make room. No one spoke. Even the boards seemed to listen. They turned into a storage corridor just aft of the captain's cabin, and the ship gave them the answer. A body lay on the planks, thrown there like refuse, naked, arms bent wrong with the careless weight of death. And where a face should have been, there was only ruin. Not gore, not drama, just a smashed, unrecognizable mess, as if someone had taken a mallet to identity itself. The lantern light made the wet wood shine around him, reflecting in strips like broken mirror. A sailor near the doorway crossed himself. Another stared too hard, as if staring could turn it back into a man he knew. Corvin crouched without haste. He looked at the man's hands, the nails, the calluses, the marks where rope often bit. He looked at the feet. Then he looked at the floor around the head, and he went still, not from pity, from calculation. Adrian stepped closer, careful, not because he was afraid of the corpse, but because he understood the rules of rooms where death arrived with intention. His gaze dropped to the broken face, then to the wall post beside it. There, at about the height of a man's cheek, was a faint dusting of yellow-gold powder, not soot, not sawdust, speckled across the timber, across the deck, across the side beam. Like something had popped. Adrian's eyes narrowed, and you could almost hear his mind begin to move. Corvin followed Adrian's stare. "What is that?" Corvin asked. Adrian didn't answer right away. He took one more step, leaned in, and inspected the powder the way he might inspect ink on a forged signature. "It's not flour," Adrian said softly. "Not tar, not pollen from sacks." The quartermaster swallowed. "Pollen?" Adrian's gaze lifted to Corvin. "There were stories in London 2 months ago. A clerk attached to a royal office found dead in an alley behind Whitehall. Face ruined so no one could swear to the body. Clothes missing. And there was dust on the wall, on the cobbles, at face height. A ripple moved through the watching men. Superstition didn't need proof. It only needed pattern." Corvin's voice stayed even. What did they say it meant? Adrian's eyes held his. "They said it meant the killer wore someone else's face." A silence dropped hard. One pirate scoffed, too loudly, too fast. "That's tavern talk." Adrian didn't look at him. He looked at Corvin, and his voice remained calm, as if he were discussing the weather. "If that man's clothes are gone, then someone wanted his shape." Corvin rose slowly. His crew watched him the way men watched a storm decide where to strike. Corvin's gaze swept the corridor and landed on the quartermaster. "Lock the ship down," Corvin ordered. "No one moves between decks without being seen. No one leaves this vessel. No skiffs, no boats. If the fleet hails, they wait." "Aye, Captain." Corvin's gaze slid back to the dead man. "Who was posted near my cabin?" The quartermaster licked his lips. "Night watch, Captain. Crane, Hobb, and one of the boys." Corvin's eyes sharpened. "Crane." "Aye." Corvin looked at Adrian, not asking, measuring. Adrian met his gaze with a small lift of the chin, as if to say, "Yes, this is the part where I am useful." "Start there," Adrian said. "If someone needed access to your cabin, they wouldn't crawl through the whole ship. They'd start where the door is." Corvin's mouth twitched, the smallest acknowledgement. "Bring Crane," Corvin ordered. The quartermaster hurried off. Adrian's gaze returned to the body. His expression didn't soften, but it sharpened into something more precise. "The face smashed," Adrian murmured, almost to himself. "Not for cruelty, for uncertainty, so no one can say with any confidence who it was. That's not random violence." Corvin watched him. Adrian felt the weight of the stare and turned his head slightly. "What?" Adrian asked. Corvin's eyes stayed on him. "You think like a man who's been in court too long." Adrian's lips curved faintly. "You say that as if it's an insult." Corvin didn't deny it, but he also didn't look away.
Crane didn't come. Not at first. Then a boy ran down the corridor, breathless, eyes white. "Captain," the boy said, "Crane ain't in his post." Corvin didn't move. His voice stayed level. "Find him." The boy bolted. Adrian's gaze slid to Corvin's cabin door, then back to the corridor. "You see it," Adrian said quietly. Corvin didn't answer, but his hand returned to his pistol. They moved. Corvin's cabin was shut. The quartermaster's key scraped in the lock and turned. Inside, the lantern still burned. The table still held the opened letter, the map, the coins. But something had changed. Not the big things, the small. The room had the feel of being handled, the way a room felt after someone had searched it with care. Corvin crossed to the table in 3 strides. He checked the cipher scrap first. The scrap was still there. So was the letter. Adrian watched Corvin's hands, watched the way Corvin didn't touch anything he didn't need to. Then Adrian's gaze flicked to the floor, to the edge of the table leg, to the wooden post beside the door. There, a faint golden dusting, as if a small explosion had breathed and then died. Adrian inhaled, then didn't, like the dust might be listening. Corvin followed the look. His eyes went colder. "That wasn't there," Corvin said. Adrian nodded once. "Someone changed face in here, or near here," Adrian said. A pirate at the door muttered, "Devil work." Corvin turned his head. The pirate shut his mouth. Corvin looked at Adrian. "How certain are you?" Corvin asked. Adrian's voice stayed careful, enough that if you ignore it, you deserve what happens next. Corvin's mouth almost curved. Almost. And then he said, flat and practical, "Then you stay with me." Adrian's brows lifted. Corvin didn't flinch. "You're not safe alone, not on my ship, not if someone is wearing my men." Adrian's gaze held his for a beat longer than comfort required. Then Adrian nodded. "Fine," Adrian said,
But if I'm under your protection, Captain, you're going to have to protect me from your crew's imagination, too." A low chuckle ran through the corridor. Corvin's eyes cut toward the sound. It died instantly. Corvin's voice remained calm. "My men know the difference between desire and permission." Adrian's smile was thin. "Then I look forward to watching them remember it." Corvin didn't smile, but his stare for the briefest moment carried something like approval. They found Crane at last. Not alive. Not exactly. They found a set of clothes first, shoved into a crate below decks. Boots, belt, coat, the kind of rough gear a pirate wore without thinking. And beneath it, in the shadow, a hand. A dead hand. Not the whole body, just the parts someone hadn't bothered to take. Corvin stood over it, still as stone. Adrian's gaze moved over the scene. He didn't flinch. He didn't perform sorrow. He performed attention. "Whoever did this," Adrian said quietly, "didn't need the whole body." Corvin's jaw tightened. He needed the skin. Adrian nodded. The quartermaster's voice shook. "Captain, what is this?" Corvin's gaze lifted. "It's theft, not of gold." His eyes slid to Adrian. "Of position." Adrian's lips parted slightly. "You mean," Adrian said, "someone took a face and took a post." Corvin didn't answer, because the answer was now the air itself. And then the ship gave them another piece. A faint powder burst, fresh, along the beam near the ladder, at face height. Gold dust, like someone had clapped a flower to death. Adrian turned his head slowly and saw a man standing in the passage. A crewman, wet-haired, eyes down, moving with deliberate calm. He looked ordinary. That was the problem. Adrian's gaze stayed on him. "Stop," Adrian said. The crewman paused. Corvin's hand went to his pistol. The crewman lifted his head. His face was Crane's face, but his eyes were wrong. Too steady. Too amused.
Adrian's voice stayed mild. "Crane, tell me what you called the quartermaster last night." The man blinked once. A small thing, but it was the blink of a man searching memory that wasn't his. Corvin's voice went quiet. "Answer him." The man's mouth twitched. "We've no time for games." Adrian smiled. A court smile, polite, deadly. "This isn't a game. This is a test, and you're failing it." The crewman's gaze flicked to Corvin's pistol, then to the ladder. Then he moved. Fast. Too fast for a normal man. He slammed his shoulder into the quartermaster, bolted for the passage, and as Corvin lunged, there was a sharp pop. A burst of gold dust exploded in the air. Adrian jerked back, coughing once. Corvin didn't cough. He drove forward through the haze like he'd been built to walk through storms. The man's face shifted. Not smoothly, violently, like skin was a mask being ripped and replaced. For a half-second, it was Crane. Then it was someone else. A different jaw, different mouth, different eyes. A young man, handsome in a way that felt expensive, too clean for a pirate, too controlled. He drew a blade. Corvin drew steel. The fight was sudden and brutal. The corridor was too narrow for flourish, too close for elegance. It was all wrists and shoulders and impact. Corvin shoved him back against the beam. The man twisted free with a serpent's grace and struck low. Corvin caught his wrist, not with panic, with certainty. The blade clattered. The man smiled, and in that smile there was arrogance that belonged in a palace, not a ship. "You're Corvin Vane," the man said, breathless, delighted. "God, you're even larger than the stories." Corvin didn't answer. He punched him hard enough to make the lantern rattle on its hook. The man staggered. Adrian watched, mind racing. He wasn't thinking like a victim. He was thinking like a detective, like a man who understood the shape of power.
"Your face," Adrian said sharply. "It's not stable. That dust, it bursts when you change." The young man's gaze flicked to Adrian. Something like curiosity lit there. "Adrian Harrow," he said, tasting the name. "So you're real." Corvin moved again. The young man ducked, grabbed the ladder rail, and vaulted upward, toward the captain's cabin, toward the cipher scrap. Corvin followed without hesitation. Adrian followed too, because Corvin had ordered it, and because Adrian's pride refused to be left behind like luggage. They hit the cabin door. It was locked. Corvin slammed his shoulder into it. Wood groaned. Adrian reached for the key hook by the beam, fingers fast. "Captain," Adrian said, and for once his voice carried real urgency. "He's going for your papers." Corvin's eyes flashed. "I know." The lock gave. They burst into the cabin. The young man was already at the table, one hand sweeping, searching. His fingers found the cipher scrap. He snatched it. Corvin was on him instantly. Corvin caught him by the collar and threw him back hard enough to knock breath loose. The man hit the wall and laughed. Actually laughed. "You're fast, but you're not fast enough to stop the tide." Corvin's pistol came up. The barrel kissed the young man's forehead. "Drop it," Corvin said. The young man's eyes gleamed. Adrian stepped closer, voice calm. "You're Swedish," Adrian said. The young man's smile sharpened. "And you're observant." Adrian nodded towards the man's coat stitching, the cut, the quality, the little details that weren't English. "Also," Adrian added, "you smell like a court, not a ship." Corvin's voice stayed low. "Name yourself." The young man's gaze slid between them like a knife finding a seam. "Roderick Prince. Major, if titles matter to you, they shouldn't." The name landed, not because Corvin knew it, because Adrian did. Adrian's expression shifted, the smallest crack of recognition. Corvin saw it. "You've heard it," Corvin said to Adrian. "A name," Adrian said carefully. "A rumor. A man attached to Swedish interests, too well dressed for the work he's said to do." Prince's smile widened. "London tells stories, and you, pretty Harrow, listen." Corvin's pistol didn't move, but his voice went colder. "Don't speak to him like that." Prince's eyes flicked. "Protective." Corvin's gaze didn't soften. Practical. Prince's attention returned to the cipher scrap in his hand. Then he did something stupid. He ran. Corvin grabbed him. Steel flashed. Prince twisted, face shifting again mid-motion, the pollen bursting like a tiny bomb. For a heartbeat, he wore a different man's mouth, then another. Corvin snarled, not with fear, but with anger. He slammed Prince into the table. Coins jumped, wax dripped. Adrian moved fast, grabbed the lantern and shoved it closer. Light, heat, smoke. Prince flinched at the flame in a way that was not human instinct. It was magical instinct, like the fire offended the mask. Adrian clocked it instantly. "The light," Adrian said. "You can't hold a face under certain flame." Prince's eyes flashed at him too sharp. Corvin heard it too. Corvin used it. He drove Prince towards the lantern, towards the harsh, flickering light. Prince hissed through his teeth. The borrowed face began to fail at the edges, not melting, not grotesque, just a subtle wrongness, like a painting being scraped off. Corvin seized him. A cipher scrap fell. Adrian snatched it off the floor before it could slide beneath the table. Corvin pinned Prince with his forearm, and for the first time, Prince looked less amused. Corvin's voice went quiet.
"You killed my man," Corvin said. Prince's breath came fast. "I wore your man," he corrected. "There's a difference." Corvin hit him again, not to torture, to end the argument. They bound Prince in iron and rope, dragged him into a storage room that became a cell. Corvin stood over him, lantern in hand, eyes like frost. "You came with the men who took Adrian," Corvin said. Prince smiled through blood. "I came with men," Prince said. "I left with opportunity." Adrian stood beside Corvin, wrists still bound, posture still perfect. "You killed one of them on land," Adrian said, tone mild, "took his face, then killed another here when you needed a new post close to the cabin." Prince's eyes went bright. "Oh," Prince said, "you really are clever." Corvin's gaze didn't move. "Why?" Prince's smile thinned. "The cipher," Prince said. "It's older than your ship, older than your legend. It doesn't belong to you."
Corvin's voice stayed calm. "Everything on this ship belongs to me." Prince's eyes slid to Adrian. "And him?" Prince asked softly. Corvin's answer came instantly. "He's under my protection." Adrian's eyes flicked sideways. Something in his expression warmed, dangerously. Prince's smile returned, sharper. "That's going to make this so much more fun," Prince murmured. Corvin leaned closer. "You're not leaving this ship," Corvin said. Prince's gaze held his. "You're going to learn, Captain, that fleets are big, and chaos is bigger." Chaos arrived within the hour, not from inside the ship, from the sea. A lookout screamed from above, "Sails!" Corvin was already moving. The deck was a cold stage of fog and dawn-gray light. The fleet surrounded them like shadows of giants, but out of the mist came sleek shapes. Warships, not English. Their lanterns were masked, their lines were clean, Swedish. A cannon boomed, not aimed at Corvin's flagship, aimed at the edge ships, the escorts, the smaller teeth around the great jaw of his fleet. The shot landed. Wood cracked. Men shouted. Corvin's crew snapped into motion, disciplined in their violence. Corvin's voice cut through the noise like a rope pulled tight. "Hold formation!" Another cannon, a second impact. Smoke bloomed. The fog ate it. Adrian stood at Corvin's shoulder because Corvin had ordered it, and because Adrian understood the truth. In chaos, proximity was survival. Corvin glanced at him once. "Stay," Corvin said. Adrian's voice was calm. "I'm not going anywhere." Corvin's jaw tightened. He turned back to the sea, and that was the moment Prince was waiting for. Below decks, a small pop, a burst of gold dust. A sailor coughed, swore, turned, and saw himself, or thought he did. Faces changed, confusion spread, and Prince, wearing a new mask, moved through the ship like a knife through cloth. He didn't need to win a war. He needed one thing: the cipher. Corvin felt it before he understood it, a shift in the air, a wrongness that didn't belong on his ship. He turned sharply, eyes sweeping the deck, the crew, the fog, searching for what had changed. The quartermaster broke through the haze, breathless, his face drawn tight with panic. "Captain, he's gone." Corvin's gaze went still. "Who?" "The prisoner, Prince. The lock, it's open. There's dust everywhere, like he burst it." Corvin moved in an instant. He caught Adrian by the bound wrists and hauled him close. Adrian's eyes widened, but he didn't fight it. Corvin, quiet, dangerous, controlled. "You don't leave me." "I'm not trying to." Corvin drove for the cabin. The door stood open. The lantern still burned. The table looked wrong, shifted, handled. Corvin's hand went straight to the spot where the cipher scrap should have been. Empty. The cabin seemed to chill all at once. Corvin went very still, then breathed out slowly, controlled, like he was forcing the fire back down. Adrian's gaze tracked the room. then dropped. Floor, beam, wall. The gold dust was there again, sprayed in a crescent as if something had exhaled hard and left its breath behind. Adrian, quiet certainty, disturbed. He changed in here. Corvin, flat, lethal. He stole it. A shout ripped down from the deck above, raw and loud enough to cut through the fog. Deck, bellow, distant, wind cut. Boat! Corvin was already moving. They hit the deck in time to see it, a small skiff sliding away into the fog, oars kept quiet. A figure hunched inside, working with practiced speed. And beyond it, for a heartbeat, the dark curve of a Swedish warship emerged from the haze like a beast surfacing. A rope dropped, hands caught it, the skiff vanished into the larger ship's shadow. Corvin raised his pistol and fired once. The shot disappeared into the fog. Pointless.
The Swedish ship's cannons boomed again, not to sink Corvin, but to cover the retreat. Smoke, noise, distraction, and then, like a curtain drawn, the Swedish ships pulled away into the mist. Gone. Corvin stood at the rail, wet wind whipping his coat. His face did not show rage. It showed something worse, a calm that meant the rage had been folded away for later. Adrian stood beside him, breath steady, eyes sharp. He wanted it badly, Adrian said. Corvin's voice stayed quiet. So do I. Adrian's gaze slid to Corvin. And now he has it, Adrian said. Corvin looked at him, not as a hostage, as a resource, as a man. As long as he has it, Corvin said, he'll think he's ahead. Adrian's mouth curved faintly. And you, Adrian said, will take that personally. Corvin's eyes didn't soften, but they did something close. I told you, Corvin said, 3 nights. Adrian's brows lifted. For what? Corvin's gaze turned back to the fog, to the land that waited like a judge. To turn the board and make him regret touching what's mine. Adrian watched him for a long beat, then softly, as if offering a blade wrapped in silk. And in the meantime, Captain, Adrian said, the Crown is going to decide my absence is proof of guilt. Corvin's jaw tightened. Adrian went on, voice cool, precise. A court does not need truth. It needs a story that fits. Corvin's eyes narrowed. Adrian's gaze drifted toward land. And if someone is writing confessions, Adrian said, they will write mine first, then yours. Corvin's voice was low. Let them try.
Greymark House sat above the coast like it had been nailed there, dark stone and salt wind, looking down on a harbor that could make a man rich or dead, depending on which flag he carried. By the time the royal agents arrived, the household already knew something was wrong, not by announcement, by the way servants moved too quickly and spoke too softly, by the fact that the Duke had been dressed for court when there was no court to attend. The great hall was lit for day but still felt dim, candle clusters burning anyway because people did not trust mornings anymore. A fire hissed low in the grate. The long table shone with beeswax and careful hands. His Grace Thomas Harrow, Duke of Greymark, sat at the high end beneath the painted ceiling. His posture was correct. His face was arranged into grief, as if grief were a thing one wore in public. The doors opened. Boots, steel, wet wool. 2 royal agents entered first, cloaks dark with travel, followed by a clerk with a ledger hugged tight to his chest like a shield. Behind them came a small escort of armed men who did not look around like visitors. They looked around like owners. And then, last, as if the hall had been framed for her, Lady Sebastienne Vale. She did not hurry, and she did not apologize for making men wait. Black satin moved with her, drinking candlelight, and pearls sat at her throat with the composure of money. She crossed the hall as if she had already seen where every eye would land and had approved it. She stopped at the table and set down a leather packet, not carelessly, not dramatically, like a woman laying a wager. Then she slid one gloved finger off and pressed her bare thumb lightly into the wax seal on the packet, leaving a clean print without breaking it. The seal was Harrow green. It wasn't a question, it was a message to the room. I can touch your color and live. Only then did she look at the Duke. "Your Grace," she said, sweet as manners, "you look tired." The Duke's voice came out level. "Your Grace." She did not stand. Standing would have made it look like she had entered with authority over him, and Thomas Harrow did not give ground on principle. "What is this?" he asked, though his gaze had already moved to the packet, to the wax, to the men who had brought it. One of the agents cleared his throat. "By warrant of His Majesty's Council." Sebastian lifted a single finger. The agent stopped mid-sentence, like a musician cut off by a conductor. She smiled at the Duke as if they were sharing a private joke. "Let's not waste breath on titles," she said. "We're here because your son's name has become inconvenient." A small, brittle sound ran through the hall. A servant dropped a tray somewhere in the back and froze, praying no one had noticed. The Duke's eyes did not flick toward the sound. His control held. "My son," he said, voice carefully pitched so the servants would hear what he wanted them to hear. "My second son is 20. He is a nobleman of this realm. If you've come to tell me the crown intends to do nothing while a pirate holds him."
Sebastian made a sympathetic sound, practiced and perfect. "You still think this is about rescue?" The Duke's eyes narrowed. "What is it about, then?" She tapped the leather packet with one pale fingernail. "It's about why a man like Corvin Vane would take your son and not simply burn him for sport." She let the words sit a moment, then added softer, almost kind. "It's about why your son's name is turning up in places it shouldn't." The clerk stepped forward at the agent's nod and opened his ledger to a marked page. He didn't read yet. He waited for Sebastian's pleasure. The Duke looked from the ledger to the packet. "That wax is mine," he said. "Yes, that's why it's so helpful." Thomas Harrow's voice stayed steady, but the temperature in it dropped. "Are you accusing my house of aiding piracy?" Sebastian smiled again, that blade beautiful smile. "I'm accusing your house of being usable." She turned her head slightly, addressing the hall, the servants, the invisible ears of gossip beyond the walls. "Captain Vane's men were taken by the Navy, ambushed with the right names at the right tide, as if someone had written the sea a schedule." Her eyes returned to the Duke. "And now your son is missing," she continued, "and the king's convoy was struck, and a Harrow seal appears where it has no business appearing." The Duke's grief mask held, but his eyes betrayed something else for half a second, calculation, not sorrow. "Why are you here in my hall?" he asked quietly. "Why not send this to me like any other council matter?" Sebastian's gaze slid past him, past the fire, past the table, as if she could already see the corridor that led deeper into Greymark House. "Because paper is only powerful when it arrives with witnesses, and because Greymark has materials the Crown would like to inspect." There it was, the real purpose. Not condolences, not rescue. A sanctioned search, a public framing, a private hunt for what Harrow kept hidden. The Duke's voice remained calm, because it had to. "My son was kidnapped by a pirate. That is the only truth you have so far." Sebastian's expression warmed with something that looked like pity until you noticed it didn't reach her eyes. "Oh, you'll have more truth before this day is done." She nodded once to the agent. "Read the warrant."
and the hall, with all its polished oak and quiet servants, became a courtroom without a judge, while the Duke sat very still and realized the worst part. Sebastienne hadn't come to ask permission. She'd come to own the narrative.